The Old School is brought to you by Ahart Solutions, which provides school surveys and applied research. More information at ahartsolutions.com.
And good morning. Welcome to the Old School Podcast, a podcast about the American education system, ostensibly, but we have been known to dabble into other topics as we did last week. We will go back to our bailiwick. We'll go back to the tried and true. We'll go back to education today. And with me in that endeavor is Dr. Stephen Bourgeois. Good morning, sir.
Hey, Miller. Good to see you again. I feel like we're back in business, after a bit of a hiatus. Last week was a historically great episode, I think, because you were well rested. You were not at all grumpy. And for my part, I was not grumpy either. So you don't run into that confluence very often, but it happened.
Well, before we tie into that, we should take note of the gentleman with us today. Would you care to introduce him?
Well, we introduced him once before, like 5 years ago. So I think our listeners would remember Dr. Matt Post. But he's been working, he's a friend of Ahart and a friend of mine and a friend of yours for a long time. And we've been doing a lot of work together in the area of virtue, if you can believe that, Ross. I'm studying virtue. And
Well, sometimes virtue can be hit and miss. We were talking about going up to Quebec last week,
yeah,
and the idea of the stereotype of being reserved combined with the snobbishness of French sensibilities. Quebec kind of has a lot going on up there. Not to do with our very fine friend Matt Post, who is actually from the further south in Canada, but the question about how do you teach people how to react in certain situations? I, as you know, have by nature, or sometimes rather cantankerous disposition.
no, come on, Ross.
And so, I think FAA is getting a little chippy at the security lines, because when I went through the security line at Dallas Fort Worth, they tell you to take everything out of your pocket. The problem is that I have my glasses in my shirt pocket and I never think about it. It's just one of those things that's just constantly there. And so you don't think about it. You take out your wallet, you take out all the things out of your pants, but you don't think about any pockets in your shirt. And so I walked through the security line and through the security thing, and the guy goes, so got anything in your shirt pocket? And you can see I have something in my shirt pocket. So already he's taking a rather passive aggressive approach. And I said, oh, sorry. And I take the glasses out. And then he says, this is why we tell people to take everything out of their pockets. And I'm like, okay, fine. I get it. And you don't have to, beat me over the head with it. And so he proceeds to pat my shirt pocket again. He says, is there anything else in there? And I said, well, yeah, my nipple, it's freezing cold in this place, and he immediately like jumped back a little bit. He goes, oh, go ahead and go. And so I kind of felt bad, but I didn't feel that bad. And so, virtuously speaking, I'm not sure I quite measured up at that particular moment, but
well, there's your scenario map that you can analyze through our lens.
You can add that question to your survey that you.
But welcome back to the old school, and now you can address Ross's query.
Oh yeah, thanks. Well, if I may jump in just for a second on this particular topic, I remember a couple of years ago, speaking of cantankerous, I was going through security, and my belt never sets off anything, but they do tell you to take your belt off. That's fine. They got rules. And someone was very particular about this, just like didn't even wait for me to do it. He's just like, take your belt off. What's wrong with you? Take your belt off. And I got the belt off and he's like, your pants are falling down. What's wrong with you? And I'm like, and I was kind of like, oh, he's joking around. I can take it. No, he was not joking around. He was, as you said, we're not even grumpy today. That dude was grumpy. Wow. And he was being so rude and aggressive, just to your point, Ross. I thought about saying something. And then I thought, something? And it has nothing to do with virtue. This is important to distinguish from virtue. One could say, well, Matt was really patient with him. No, I just didn't want to get detained. It was a very utilitarian response, very transactional. You have authority. You can verbally abuse me, and I will put up with it so I can get through here. And
Yes.
but I remember once I was at DFW, and a lady was going through, and they asked for something, and she took exception to it. And she just started verbally abusing them. And for the sake of not censoring me, I will not quote her. But just bear with me when I say it was rude. I mean rude and vulgar. And then she said, "What are you going to do? You're going to give me a cavity search?" I'm leaving out various expletives that were mixed in
Yeah.
there. And I was repacking my stuff, and there were two security people right beside me. And all of a sudden, like, their heads just snapped around. And they're like, "Check this out. Check this out." And they're watching, they're like, "She doesn't think we're gonna do it. Oh, she's about to have a really bad day." And then they, like, carried her away, and they're like, "Yep, yep, there it is." And I was like, "Oh my god, so they really do cavity searches." And anyway, that's what those security personnel were saying to each other. And, it's kind of interesting from a virtue perspective. You're like, "Well, she was being really nasty. Is this an outcome that's gonna help her become a better person? Is this just vengeance, Schadenfreude? I know you guys like your German, so
Well, I mean, at that point, don't you start looking around for popcorn and you just decide to settle in and kind of just wait and see how this all pans out?
Well, yeah, that's where those 2 security guys were, or actually was a gentleman and a lady, and you could tell he was just like, "You gotta watch this. Oh, it's
This is
happening," you know?
great.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
We only get these in the training videos. Here's an
Yeah,
actual case.
yeah, 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 yeah. Uh,
Jeez almighty. Well, we're talking about character, and we're talking about the measurement of character, what you guys have been doing for some time now. In some ways it kind of segues into something that so the most Texas school districts are back in business, if not last week, then this week. And with that came a couple of new policies, some which I don't think most people had issues with, dealing with phones and technology and what have you. Some dealing with changes like in school menus to kind of get rid of certain additives and preservatives and what have you. But one of the things that it seems to have caused quite a kerfuffle is the posting of the Ten Commandments. And if you wanted to be charitable, and I don't see any reason why we can't be charitable, at least here initially, one could say that this was kind of an attempt to introduce ethics or character type of instruction, albeit in a passive way, because we're just talking about posters up in a classroom. But it does kind of lead credence to, can you teach ethics? Can you teach character? Is that something that's even possible? And with y'all's work, y'all have endeavored to try to find exactly the answers to those kinds of questions. So I'm wondering, what was it about the topic that first intrigued you two? Matt, if you want to start.
oh, yeah, sure. So when I was in undergrad, I went into a great books program, and I went into it a little bit by accident. I originally applied to um, computer engineering, pre-med, and creative writing, which is a list, just tells you I wasn't really clear on what I wanted to do. And I won't get into the whole story. That'll be for another time. But I did eventually find myself in a great books program. And I'll also say this, like, I worked very hard in high school, and I had very high grades. I don't say that boastingly, who cares about that? But, but it is to say I was burnt out. So by the time I got to undergrad, I was kind of ready to cut loose a little. And so I knew that I wasn't getting everything out of these courses. I knew that I was encountering, like, amazing ideas and very challenging philosophy, literature, so on and so forth, things that were really taking me, as the cliche goes, way out of my comfort zone. But I wasn't going as deep with it as I could. But virtually everybody else was. They're just really impressive people. And by the time we got to the end of that undergrad program, people said, "Well, I guess I've got charming dinner conversation now. Now I can, like, drop Iliad references and Rousseau references at the cocktail party." And I remember thinking, like, "Oh no, do you actually think anyone finds that charming? I'm like, I got bad news for you. You don't even have charming cocktail party conversation. Like, people think that that stuff is lame and pretentious. And then I kind of thought, like, what the heck were we doing here? Why were we doing this? Because the way some of the like straight A 4.0 GPA classmates were talking about it was, to my mind, pretty depressing. But I knew I cared about it. Like I said, I didn't invest as much effort into it as I should have, but I knew I was missing something. I knew it was my deficiency. And here I'm channeling a little bit of C.S. Lewis, who also says there's a difference between thinking whether you like children or not is just a preference, or whether if you don't like children, which he said he doesn't, interestingly. He said, but I know that's a deficiency of mine. So I knew I had the deficiency. And I did want to go deep with it. So I eventually did end up devoting myself to that. But it wasn't really until I encountered classical education and people kind of talking about virtue. And it goes right back to what you said, Ross. I kind of thought, like, is this really your job? To be teaching virtue? But then it got me thinking, though, and I found that I was more passionate about it. I cared about it more. And I was kind of like, why is that? Like, why is this more important now that this is becoming more explicit? And there's this center called the Jubilee Center in the UK, and they've done a lot of research on this. And there's some people who are doing research before them too that they draw on. But essentially, what the research shows is that teachers teach character whether they intend to or not, right? And as soon as you think about it, there's ways in which that becomes clear. If you're looking at early grades, students get into conflict, they act out, right? They test boundaries in all sorts of ways. And obviously the way the teacher responds to that is going to have an influence on their character. And one of the little tricks I used to use, because I've read too much Plato, so I think about dialogical tricks is, I'd meet people and they say, well, in a classroom, you can't really teach character, you just can't. And I said, oh, okay. So I said, if a teacher or more than one teacher or the school environment is one in which teachers are often like, ordering students around, judging them, pressuring them, you don't think that would have a negative impact on them? And they're like, oh, yeah, for sure. I said, okay, now we agree that teaching has an impact. Now, if you think you can have a negative one, don't you think you can have a positive one? And more than one person has said, you tricked me. But I mean, but nevertheless, they do, right? So I think that even common sense and the research kind of aligns how we treat students, how we grade them, whether they think it's fair or not. And then you think about bigger things in the school environment. Do you give the students opportunity to mentor each other? Do you establish a caring environment? What kind of caring environment? Is it condescending, or is it something that respects them and helps them to grow? So you start to realize, no, actually, there's an immense amount of character development going on in the school. Not only there, right? It also goes with peers, family members, other community things that the students are involved in, things that they see on social media, having a place, but the school also has a big place in that. And what the Jubilee Center said is, so it's happening. It's not a question of whether to do it or not. It's happening. The only question is whether you're thoughtful about it or not.
And Steve, I remember one time you said with regard to child rearing that no matter what you do or how you handle a situation, someone is being trained, whether they're training you to react in a certain way or you're training them to react in a certain way, that to Matt's point, that no matter how you handle a particular situation, you're teaching something. How is it that you came to the subject? Is it observations in the classroom with your children? Is it something different that kind of sparked that interest in you?
It certainly wasn't something I studied, in my graduate work. At least on the surface, it wasn't. But it turns out, in some ways, that it was, because I studied motivational theory and self determination theory, intrinsic motivation, why people do what they do, and so the connection I had, in a way, I could put different words to it, but associating the motive, why you do something, as the core of a virtue, because people can behave in certain ways, for be kind, be generous, all these things. At least that's what the action shows. But then, what is their motivation for that? They could have all kinds of selfish reasons for very nice, generous behavior. But motivation to even call it generous, there's an implication that the motive has to be there as well. So I think I intersect on the motivational side, and it wasn't a forced connection. It felt really natural from the beginning. I learned some about Aristotle, and I learned a lot from Matt, and still am. Um, so a lot of really smart people have thought this through, but to put some numbers to it and look at the motivational theory, it's a natural fit, but it's also messy because because when you talk about somebody's motivation, it's not a singular motivation. We have motivations for
Mhm.
everything, and that's why it's audacious to say we're going to measure this, but that's what we're trying to do.
L'audace, toujours l'audace. Audacity, yes. Um, so I'm curious as to there's a pretentious Charlemagne reference, but um, but so when you set out to do this measurement, what are you trying to measure? But more importantly, what are you not trying to measure? What are you trying to get out of the way so that you can get a kind of a better sense of the project, the assignment?
um, Measuring a lot of different types of motivations at once is kind of the insight,
Mhm,
because everything appears on a continuum, and we can be extrinsic about a motivation, but also intrinsic. We could love something, but also be doing it for the grade, and so I think being aware that this is a nuanced challenge. But what we're trying to do is extend that idea of intrinsic motivation. It's something that we love to do, and so we're creating something new. It's the next step in some ways beyond. We're extending intrinsic motivation, or doing something because it's important to you, or that's the kind of person you are. To say maybe I'm doing it to develop personally, or maybe I'm doing it to help somebody. And that last one is sort of rarefied. Um, and that's the part that intrigued me, is there a way, is because before everything, if you're doing it intrinsically, you love it, you love learning whatever it is,
mhm.
that was the gold standard, that was it. And now this shows that there's something more to it, and that, I think that's what kind of hooked me and wondered, can we create a whole new category.
So, Matt, what is the things that get in the way? What are the red herrings that can lead you down and either an inconclusive or an incorrect kind of assessment of what you're measuring? Are there a lot of stumbling blocks? Are there a lot of obstacles in the way for you too?
Oh yeah, and as Steve mentioned, we've been working on this stuff for a while, and we were actually recently just talking about this, and we started in 2020 at least,
Mm,
because we have documents going back that far, which means we've been working on this now. This is the sixth year, and there's a big learning curve there, and I gotta give a lot of respect to Steve for his immense integrity as an intellectual and as a researcher, because some of our early work had great numbers in terms of trying to validate the surveys and show that these surveys are solid. They're actually measuring something. So you look at reliability, for example, correlations between things. You look at something called factor loadings. And one of our early surveys had really, really good numbers. And we use this expression for what Steve called virtuous motivation. We asked students, do you do this because you want a grade? Do you do this because you want to be liked, or you feel ashamed, so on and so forth on this motivation spectrum, until, as he says, you get to intrinsic, which is, I do it because I love it, or I enjoy it. But then beyond that, this idea of something virtuous, where it's not even about you anymore. Um, and and we had the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And I remember we were looking at the numbers and we are like, this is great. And Steve is like, we've hit a jackpot here. And we're sitting there, thinking about how great this research is going to be. And then Steve is like, Matt, these numbers are too good. He's like, I think students are looking at this and they're figuring out what we want to hear. And they're giving us the answers we're looking for. And I was like, no, yeah.
Damn it,
So I
he's
mean,
right.
yeah, I mean, and that can be a huge stumbling block. And actually, some of the instruments that have some of the greatest numbers in terms of being validated, where you look at it and you're like, in terms of, you know, showing that you've got a great methodology, this is fantastic. But then you look at the questions themselves and you're like, I really wonder if these questions are actually getting at something. And of course, that's going to be a stumbling block because you want to publish, you have a business, you want people to be committed to this. And those numbers really help. But again, to go back to Steve's integrity, sometimes a survey that isn't really telling you much is going to deliver in that way, but it's not actually meaningful. So that's one big stumbling block. Another is that virtue, at least the way Aristotle defines it, just to keep this focused, because you could get into how other people define it. But even the way Aristotle defines it is they'll say, well, virtue proper is done for the sake of the noble. So, like, he'll give this example of whether someone's courageous or not. And he's like, well, look, if they appear courageous because they've seen battle many times and they kind of know that this actually isn't that dangerous, he's like, well, that's not really courage.
Yeah.
Because courage, it has to be sincere fear. He'll say, if you're doing it for money, it's not courage. But then he gets into some that might make you hesitate. He's like, if you're doing it to protect your community and your family, it's not courage. You're like, really? And he's like, no, because ultimately virtue is for the sake of the noble. And you're like, okay, what does that mean? And Steve and I have talked about this a lot, and maybe we do have a grasp on what it means, but it's a big conversation. How on earth are you going to assess that? You can't ask students if you're doing this for the sake of the noble. They don't have the language. We barely have the language who've been studying it and going deep with it. So that's going to be another big stumbling block. And then some other stumbling blocks just come down to, like, frankly, just like we need to learn ourselves, what kinds of questions work. And sometimes we ask questions where we realize later we're actually asking two or three things and we think we're asking one thing, right? So there's a whole learning process, right? Where are we really asking about whether the respondent wants to help contribute to a respectful space? Or are we asking whether they really want to just learn what other people think? And you're like, well, that's the same thing. It's like, no, it isn't. I can learn from other people and be disrespectful. Steve tells me that's what you do, but no, I'm joking. so, so those are some of the main obstacles I would kind of list off the top of my head. But what would you say, Steve? Because you're really sharp on this stuff.
Well, thanks for the compliments. A lot of this comes down to money, uh, to get a little bit more grasp that, yes, this is
This is always how
research.
Steve responds when I praise his integrity. Let's talk about money now.
Uh, the tough part about doing creating a survey is that you have to give surveys to refine the survey, and so I have a lot of currency with my current clients, and they'll give a 80 item survey to their students, and it takes them time to do that. And then we look at the results, we present at a conference, we refine it, and then we change it. And we made a big change, initially starting out assessing students from grades 4 through 12. We have a new opportunity to assess undergraduates. And so suddenly it's a more nuanced instrument. We're having scenarios, as opposed to just what would you know, why would you act in this way? Now we have a specific scenario that's university studies related, and but all of that costs money, because we have to get people to take it. We're now using panel data, which is a data. It's where you engage a company that has a large sample size, and you make sure they're balanced demographically, and you get what you need to validate numerically these items. You throw away items, you keep the best ones, then you have to send it out again, and then so it's they say an iterative process. Well, it's an iterative, and you pay for it, by But we think it's well worth it, and we're incredibly close right now. I mean, our factor loadings, for those of you who are out there who are statisticians, are pretty strong. We're getting into the 0.7s and 0.8s, which means that there's something real that we're measuring, and it's not just enjoyment. It's that extra thing. So we hope that we're at a culmination right now, and we have some big groups like Arizona State, Pepperdine University, Tulsa, that are partnering with us now. And we also partnered with Grand Canyon University in the past. So we're starting to get the numbers, and we hope, from our efforts, they'll come to fruition. And I think we're very close.
You're talking about the different demographics over the years that you have measured.
Mhm.
It was part of the trial and error, the different demographics. Was it,
Mhm.
you weren't getting what you were hoping for out of the little ones or out of high schoolers, and now the undergraduates seem to be the sweet spot? Or is this just part of the process? Is there nothing inherently, incorrect about your previous research,
Uh,
people?
it's a measurement issue. If you wanted to predict student test scores, say on the state assessment,
Mhm.
you could say, well, I'm going to bet on their zip code, their neighborhood, their parents' income, and you're going to be really accurate. Maybe you're going to bet on their previous score. You're going to be incredibly accurate. Um, when you're measuring virtue and really any type of school climate question, it has to do with the grade level. And our grade level was a incredible factor, very powerful. And so essentially, what if we send out a survey on virtuous motivation, we're giving you that result, but also we're saying, how many third graders do you have? How many, or in our case, fourth graders, fifth graders, and the scores tend to be very happy, very positive, very virtuous in grades 4 and 5. Then they drop to 6. Their low point is 7th, and then they creep up a bit. And so you impose that type of a curve on a data set, it's dramatic. And so it's almost like, what are you assessing? Well, I'm assessing the student's height,
Mm,
in a line, and then virtue on top of that, but the height's way more important. Uh,
mm,
so you don't get that with undergraduates.
mm.
If their identifier is, I'm an undergraduate student attending college or university, then you're comparing apples to apples, and you don't have that grade level thing, which was a real, it was a big factor.
Matt, you look at those earlier surveys that were done with the little ones and high schoolers or what have you, not to talk shop or to, drop terms too much, but we all read about Bloom's taxonomy, the degree to which people develop morally, Kohlberg's moral development, the way that
Mhm.
people see things, see themselves as a part of something bigger. Is there an advantage of kind of getting out of that stage to people whose frontal cortex is for the most part fully developed? Is there something about the undergraduate that makes the assessment and the evaluation of the data easier as opposed to the little ones?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, to respond to a couple of things in what you just said too, about Kohlberg and stages of moral development, which, yeah, I mean, goes back to Piaget, and
Mhm,
is that one of the things subsequent studies have found is that it's not really a linear moral development. Um, there's a lot of falling back to earlier stages seeming to exist alongside each other. Um, so one of the nice things about the research that Steve and I developed is it does look at this motivational spectrum, right? So here's a possible action you could thank your fellow student. Why would you do it? Well, maybe I do it, but I just don't really care. It's just something people do, or I do it because I know people are watching and maybe I'll get praised or blamed, one way or the other if I do or don't do it. They'll like me or I'll feel guilty. No, it's important to me, actually. It's important to me to thank people. I'm the kind of person who thanks people. I enjoy being grateful, or maybe you think about how thanking people makes them feel. So there's this whole idea of a motivation spectrum. And by the way, the last one is kind of getting more at what Steve was calling virtuous. And this was something we were really working hard on to figure out what is going to be, since people don't have this language of the noble, what is something that might be more properly virtuous, but still simple enough, clear enough that it's something that we would all recognize from our everyday life. And thinking about how someone else feels is actually a pretty good indicator of that. But I mention all of this by way of circling around to your question, is that if you want to draw comparisons between students in grade 4 and students in grade 12, which is what we were doing, I just mentioned the linguistic problem, right? So, of course, we eventually did with undergraduates qualitative surveys where we were getting a sense of how do they talk about things. Because here we are, we're coming up with scenarios. We're thinking through how do kids talk based on our experience with them. But how do we know these words really mean something to them? And one of the questions that came up was, how do you know what these questions mean to someone in grade 4? Is that going to mean the same thing to people in grade 12? Um, so of course, looking at undergrads is going to make that simpler, right? Because you're looking at, these are much more fully formed adults, not completely by any means, but much more so. And the amount of cognitive development between freshman year and when they graduate doesn't really compare between grade 4 and grade 12, right? It's huge, right? Um, so you're right. There were some concerns there for us, and but I want to add two other quick things to this. One of the nice things about the motivational spectrum is that it's not strictly speaking developmental. So we don't really run afoul of the research that kind of says, actually, these developmental stages are all over the map. We're not trying to show that. We're just trying to show where these respondents are, where these people are in terms of the spectrum of their motivation. That's one thing. The second thing is that why motivation matters, and we haven't quite gotten into this just yet, um, is we're not strictly speaking measuring how virtuous the students are. We wouldn't presume to do that. What we're measuring is how likely they are to do certain actions. And that's it. Now, we might say we think of these actions as virtuous actions, and that's fine. You might look at it and say, I don't think of those actions as virtuous actions. Like, that's okay. The research still stands. You can take virtue out of it. We're just talking about what are the different kinds of motivations for one student to thank another. That's one thing. So we're not measuring their virtue, just measuring the motivational categories for their likelihood to do that action. But the second thing is that, and this is why it's really important, because we're tapping into a much bigger realm of research, self-determination theory, is that if it's quote unquote higher quality motivation, what Steve earlier said, more intrinsic motivation. So it's really, I enjoy thanking other people, or I'm thanking someone else because I'm thinking about how they feel when they're thanked. People who rank high there are more likely to actually do those actions when they're not being pressured to do them. And some people define virtue as what you do when you're not being externally pressured, right? So that would kind of hit the nail on the head. Whereas what the research shows is that when you are pressuring people to do things, they will do it. Pressuring people works, but they lose their love of it and they start to resent it. And when they're not being pressured to do it, they're not so likely to do it, right? And you see this, like someone is told, you always got to be grateful. You always got to be grateful. Always say thank you. Sometimes that person gets older, and when they're not in that environment anymore, they're like, I'm not thanking. I don't forget it. Like I was forced all the time to be like this. I'm not going to do it anymore. So that's what we're really looking at. Yeah.
So if I understand, because I'm not that smart, is if I understand what's being said here, it's a question of, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. The intent here is to measure the what and the why, Is that correct?
Yeah.
Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah.
What will a person do? Why will they do it? Is it intrinsic? Is it extrinsic? What have you? There is a sociological term called political socialization that talks about not the ideas that people have, but where they get the ideas. Is that something that can be extracted from this, or is that a whole different can of worms altogether?
Do you want to take
Because
that
we're
one,
talking,
Steve?
we're talking
Yeah.
about the idea about people, needing like ethics-based instruction or whatever the case may be, and a political socialization. Where do we get our political ideas? Well, we get them from our parents, we get it from our priests, we get it from, whomever. Is that something that can in any way be extracted where people get these ideas from about what they would do and why? Or is it too nebulous to try to figure out in a set of questions?
That's hard. I mean, we can theorize. We would, keeping with our working theory, we would say that the motivational context, particularly at home and the school, will contribute to that. Are they using tokens and rewards and threats and praise and good jobs? We think that will contribute to a more extrinsic approach, and you can foster intrinsic motivation purposefully. Um, but we've discussed this type of thing for years, Ross.
Mhm.
That type of the type of controlling parenting can work, gets results, but then once they leave on and they're a college student or a 30-year-old, have they internalized that? So, but I think that's a big question, and we're 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 using this as a pre-test and post-test model right now for universities, but I think we're going to move back to K-12 also. And so then the treatment in there could be a character education program. It could be a whole program. It could be a great books program, as
Mhm.
Matt was discussing earlier, and being exposed to things like that. So we think that we have a nice baseline measure, and then we'd use it as a post test. But the treatment is not a quick and easy treatment. It takes a lot of time
Mhm.
to measure.
And if I can jump in on this too, I would add that there is other research on this question, and you probably know it already, but I'll mention it for those listeners who may not, right? So they've done studies, for example, with very, very young children, where they just say, um, if you do this, like if you draw this little thing, we're going to give you some candy. Let's set aside the morality of rewarding kids with candy, but and then the kids do it, and they say, okay, you get 3 beans, you get 4 beans, you get one, and once they give the kid one, he's like, well, wait, what's going on? This other kid got four, and like, well, so, and like one of the reasons why they do this with super young children is they're trying to see if children, how they respond to certain transactional things, perceptions of inequality, ideas of justice, because they're trying to get at children before you can really say, well, they learned this at home, because these are kids who've barely been out of the home, right? Like they could be like they're just becoming verbal, right? So, and again, someone could say, well, they picked it up in this way or that way. So to Steve's point, it's complicated,
Mhm.
but it's nevertheless is interesting just how young children are before they have a sense of like, hey, that's not right, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and, as I kind of say to some people, the motivational stuff we're looking at between extrinsic and intrinsic, um, you can kind of say again to Steve's point, we'll go back to K through 12 at some point. The problem of making sure the students understand the questions is completely overcomable.
Mhm.
But you could kind of say, well, some of this is pretty complicated. I mean, can they really understand the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic? And it's like, yeah, a 2-year-old understands the difference between you ordering them to do something and them just wanting to do it. Like, not only do they understand it, they respond,
Yeah.
Like, so, yeah.
There's so many
Mhm.
quite such a fascinating topic. There's so many questions I have, but I also want to get a little bit into the meat of what y'all have already discovered, if you can even make conclusions so far. But based off of what the research that you've done to this point. What have you discovered?
I can give some high level findings without getting into factor loadings and a little nuance. But just to show that our we will call it a hypothesized construct, what we think is called virtuous motivation. It's not a overreaching meta theory of all motivation, meaning we need to break it up into motivation, virtuous motivation that's moral or civic. Those tend to move together, and then there's a whole other side of it, which is intellectual and performance virtues. And so we have learned that we don't look at this whole thing as a meta concept. This is your number for virtuous motivation, and we need to split those because they behave differently statistically. And so we've in our wisdom, we hope, decided to present those results separately.
Mhm.
The other key finding would be that virtuous motivation in those two main areas is different. It's independent from intrinsic motivation or doing something because that's the kind of person you are, or it's important to you. So we do have a separate domain or construct, and we've shown that in both sides of that. And so that, I think that alone is really big. And then um, beyond that, we're trying to find what is it that predicts this type of virtuous motivation, and that's where we're going outside. We're looking at other instruments that already exist to see what is it, what type of say classroom conditions would foster this, or what type of parenting style. So we're looking at that, and that is a correlational type predictive um, analysis. So we're getting there, but we want a big data set to make those big statements. But so to summarize, we have something. It is a construct, but it's really two separate ones. Moral and civic is one half of it, and then performance type virtues and intellectual is something separate.
So we're too early to tell. Would you say that, Matt?
Well, actually,
To a degree?
interestingly, I think kind of going back to what Steve said, I think we actually have some pretty significant results already, but it's true, we need to do more. And to kind of make sure we're seeing what we think we're seeing. And we need to test it in different environments and see if the
That's
same
important.
patterns emerge. But a couple of other quick things I'd add to what Steve said is one thing we're looking at in particular is something called the moral knowledge action gap, which in everyday language is just maybe you know the right thing to do, but you don't do it. Um, but it's a little bit more than that. It was this guy, Augusto Blasi, in 1980 found that programs that purported to cultivate character led to negligible outcomes in terms of the students. Now that's in a way pretty damning, right? Like,
Mhm.
if I say I'm teaching these folks how to build bridges, and the people who get the education versus the people who don't get the education don't build significantly better bridges, you should ask, what's the point of the education? And
Mhm.
why should we invest in it? Why should we care? And yet at the same time, we don't let go of this notion of character. And I'll come back to that in a second. But despite this, and by the way, these findings have been affirmed over and over again. But we can't let go of the idea of character. And going back to Jubilee, it's like, well, you do it whether you intend to or not. And common sense seems to say, like, if a teacher's mistreating the students, it is a bad thing, So, okay, so why? So how do we parse this together? These programs don't seem to be having any meaningful effect, but on the other hand, everyday experience tells us it does matter. And I think that what Steve was talking about, self-determination theory, is really important because, again, what it shows is controlling educational environments. That is, environments that are trying to pressure you in some way or another. Uh, and by the way, this is something I really learned from Steve in the early days that got me excited about this. Is he said praise is a way of controlling people. I thought praising
Mhm.
students was a good thing. He's like, now he said it depends on how you do it, but he said most praise is controlling because you're really making it about you. It's a tap on the head that they get from you. And I was like, that blew my mind. I was just like, oh man, I've been screwing up. Thank you, Steve. So yeah, 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 yeah. Um, but but it seems so obvious that's what you should do. And I'm like, okay, this is actually important. So you think you're encouraging someone and helping them to grow in character by praising them all the time. Maybe you're undermining their intrinsic motivation and setting them up to kind of turn their backs on it later in life. So the point is that this theory actually predicts what Blasey found. Character programs are actually not going to increase people's motivation precisely because those programs probably have a high likelihood of being controlling. Now, I say high likelihood because this is based on the description of them. What we don't have is research, right? So let's say you get the research and the research does show, yeah, controlling environments do undermine intrinsic motivation. And then the alternative is autonomy supporting environments. And we know a lot about what those things look like. Steve has developed modules on how to do character education in an autonomy supporting way. And for people who don't like that word of autonomy, you can say things that respect the student's liberty, tries to encourage them towards self-governance, gives them the freedom to kind of find the love for themselves, but supports them in this, right? It's not just hands off, but it's not coercive, it's not didactic. And if someone was like, well, I don't know what that looks like, that's fine, because there's a lot of research on what that looks like. And again, to repeat, Steve has developed modules on this, and so have I. So it's about looking at, yeah, exactly. What does this classroom environment, how can we change this classroom environment to teach in a way that will actually help the student define this love for themselves and cultivate that character? That's one thing. The second thing that we have in our research is we also connected to something in self-determination theory called basic psychological need satisfaction. Now, these things are in the technical terminology competence, relatedness, and autonomy. Competence just means you're encountering challenges that aren't too difficult or too easy. So you are actually excited and interested and engaged, and you're growing in your skills. Relatedness, as you would guess, just means meaningful connection with others. And autonomy is what I was just talking about. Like, do you have the freedom to kind of figure out things for yourself, to make some decisions for yourself? And as we know, to use more popular language, that gives you ownership and helps cultivate commitment. So it is in a way kind of common sense in a way to think like, yeah, if I don't pressure them, they might be more likely to do it. But again, when you're in an environment where you're teaching, it's also common sense to be like, well, I gotta teach it. So again, there's a conflict there. So we need to kind of untangle that. But what self-determination theory has found is that when these three basic psychological needs are satisfied, and by the way, they're not saying those are the only ones. Someone might say, well, what about my relationship to God? Okay. But they're not saying these are the only ones, but they're saying these are among them, and they're very important. And high psychological need satisfaction correlates with high mental health and high physical health. And they've even done research with people on Wall Street who think they're awesome, but rank really low on relatedness. And they rank lower in mental health and physical health. So that's very important because they're like, look, it's not about self-perception. You can think you're awesome, and yet you are still suffering. So this is another part of our research. So on the one hand, character and motivation for character-related actions. As Steve said, classroom environment and how that influences it. And then how all of this influence psychological need satisfaction, mental and physical well-being. And forgive me for talking so long. This is one of my deep vices. I'll work on it for next time. This kind of circles back to what I was talking about in the beginning, right? When I said there was something missing for me and I knew I had a deficiency, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then I was with these classmates who were super smart, but like saw no real value in what we were learning. And I was like, what the heck was going on there? And the point is that all of this research really helps explain all of those things. Why was I more inclined to fall in love with the things than some of my classmates? It's because they are very high performing people, because there were a lot of pressures on them, parents, social pressures. They had to succeed in life. Whereas for better or worse, I just did not feel that pressure, obviously, because I was slacking. But not feeling that pressure the way they were, I fell in love with the text in the way that they didn't. And that's not a deficiency in them. It's because they were pressured. And maybe if they hadn't been so pressured, they might have been at liberty to fall in love with it, but that was taken away from them. And then thinking about why something was missing anyway, what is it I was looking for? And I hate to say, like, Aristotle does answer this question, and it's that it's about happiness. That's why character matters. That's why just being like, well, can you tell me all these different things about the Iliad? Yes, I can. Well, why is it that I don't care that much about that?
Right.
because I need to get into what's deeply going on in the Iliad. What's going on in the Iliad is the insane human capacity to degrade each other and how deeply hurtful that is, not just to the people that you degrade, but to yourself, which it reveals in these remarkable ways. And this wonderful French thinker, Simone Weil, kind of points this out. She's like, look how often Homer uses metaphors of animals. She's like, she's talking about how we degrade ourselves and each other. And I'm like, oh
Right.
man, you're right. Before I thought about the art of it, I didn't realize like this is actually a deep teaching, psychological teaching. And I never really understood why the Iliad began where it began or why it ended where it ended. And then I realized it begins where it begins because it begins with the moment where someone like Achilles, who is a master of degrading other people and feeling awesome about it, has his psychological break. And he doesn't know why he's broken. And it ends with the moment when he forgives someone that he hates. So it actually shows you that is extremely important, is that that activity of degradation for your honor, so you can feel awesome, so you can feel excellent, is something that destroys you. And forgiving someone that you think you hate also kind of amounts to forgiving yourself in a way, and that's healing. And that actually helps you to grow and actually helps you to become happier and to confront trauma. And once you start to see that, you're like, that's why I care about this. That's why I care about this. And if you read it carefully, I mean, this is going to sound a little self-serving, but like Homer actually says, like, you need to inspire people. You can't force them. And when you inspire them, you help them to find it for themselves. That's what our research is about, helping people, support them to find for themselves how to grow in character, heal the psychological wounds, become better human beings, because that's how they're going to be happier.
As I said, there's so many questions here that I could ask, and I have to. I'm trying to limit myself, but I have two. And while you work on your long-windedness, although I'm sure it'll be to our detriment, but the I wanted to just pose these two ideas to y'all and ask you. And again, it's coming from someone who doesn't know the nuance and inner workings of this. Steve was talking about the idea of how this could be, the results of which could be applicable, within a classroom, within a school, within a certain kind of environment. And maybe this is too long of a question to address now, but is there a difference, and if so, what is the difference between a virtuous, an ethic, or a moral education? Do these three things Is it too nuanced a distinction that separates these three things, or is there something very clear that separates ethical, virtuous, and moral education?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm saying it would be a reach to say that this is the ideal way to cultivate that, and my more political answer is that this is being cultivated in individual classrooms every day by teachers who have a sense for a lot of this, but it's not necessarily part of the program and the way that they're trained. But you have some educators who just by instinct or something are doing an incredible job teaching virtue. By just calling yourself a classical school, that won't do it. But the curriculum is using that language, and you're looking at these incredible examples from these full text books. So I think that there are ways to purposefully cultivate it, and that was that was a plug for classical education, for liberal arts, which we all love, great books, all of these things. But I think that it's the individual teacher and the individual interactions with the students that are going to multiply and have the greatest effect, just like the parents in the home. Matt.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I'd say also going to your specific question, Ross, is that, yeah, those different words, ethical, virtuous, and moral, are very tricky because it depends on how the person you're talking to defines them. Um, I'd say this in terms of the kinds of people that we're looking back at philosophically. Um, Moral just comes from the Latin translation of the Greek word from which we get ethical. Um, so linguistically, they're more or less the same word. It's just one is the Greek and one is the Latin. And both of them kind of have to do with customary things that people do originally, right? So moral and mores are related. But just the kinds of things that we do customarily. And then virtuous originally just kind of refers to a particular kind of excellence, and could be used for different things. And we find among the ancients, at least in the Greek, they'll talk about like the virtue of the eyes, which we normally would not talk like that, right? I don't know if my eyes are nice people or not, but that's not what they mean. They just mean the eyes performing their function really well. But I will add one thing to all of this. I do think that when it comes to what we call moral virtue, it is tricky to define, right? We kind of know what we mean until you get a couple of questions that are kind of confusing, like, oh, is honesty a moral virtue? Sure. So if someone says to me, uh, how do I look in this dress? Like, how honest should you be in answering that question if you think it's bad? And you're like, well, maybe you should tell them, but you should be delicate about it. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so you're saying I should qualify my honesty. If honesty is a virtue, why does it need to be qualified, right? So one of the things Steve and I did in our research is I do think there is a way of defining moral virtue, which, for the sake of exercising a little bit of brevity, I won't go into that definition of moral virtue, but I will say, because it has four components, and I there'd be an explanation, but one thing I would say though is that caring about how other people feel, and thinking about what's good for them. So not just caring about how they feel, but maybe thinking about good feelings for them, and also just good things for them. And that's complicated too. How do you assess what's a benefit for another human being? But there's only so much you can do in a survey. So when it came to the moral and the civic realm versus intellectual virtues like curiosity, or performance virtues like resilience, but things like being grateful, being compassionate. We really wanted to focus on, your understanding of others. And that's something that we can kind of get at. And I don't think that fully gets at what the moral is, but it's a survey. It's not a philosophical treatise. Um, and to kind of wrap up these comments and reaffirm what Steve said, I think that a lot of us do end up benefiting students in ways that we're not fully aware of. But my instinct is, and I think there is some research that shows this, is that actually a lot of it comes down to whether the teacher naturally cares for the students. Uh, and interestingly, students, I think there's research on this, I have to double check, that students will learn more from a teacher who cares about them, but otherwise, like, is not the best pedagogically. Like, their explanations are confused. Maybe they don't necessarily know the material as great as others. But students will often learn more from that teacher. Now, and then there's a teacher who like knows a ton and just does not care about the students. And there's a certain kind of student that learns a lot from that teacher. But most students don't, because they get in the classroom, they can tell the teacher doesn't care. And then the student kind of checks out. So the hyper intelligent, uncaring teacher is good for a certain kind of student, but not for them broadly. Broadly, the caring teacher is going to be better. But again, I think there's a lot of importance in looking at the research, because as I said, there are ways in which we do try to care for those students, like ways that we praise them, that might end up undermining certain things that we just don't intend to. And like I said before, that when Steve told me about that it kind of blew my mind, the ways I needed to change as a teacher.
I think the last question I might hold off, not in bringing it up, but maybe in discussing it, because I think it might be a great second episode. We're talking about there's a kind of a current movement, free range parenting, play, emphasis on play, and emphasis on being outdoors. The idea of trying to remove parents sometimes from the kids' experience and what they do and how early they do things, what have you. And you were talking about the degree to which somebody can feel like they own their actions, and to the degree to which you can learn how to properly own your actions. It'd be fascinating to kind of connect the two ideas. but it may also be something that's worthy of its own kind of episode. So kind of plant that idea in your head, but then we'll kind of table that to use modern corporate parlance. But the idea of maybe tabling that for a future episode. But Matt, it was so great to have you on. It's amazing listening to you talk, and of course, it's amazing listening to Steve talk. And I think people will enjoy this episode because I'm not talking that much, and so it's good to kind of to have some smarter folks kind of take the reins, as it were. But
You're being unfair to yourself here, Miller. You managed this incredibly well. And you're delving into people who are, I mean, we were working on this survey right before the call, for 2 hours, and we have moral virtues on the brain. I think we talked a lot about moral virtues, a little less on the intellectual and on the performance, because this is what we're developing. And you actually, I mean, by doing this, I have even a little bit more clarity about some of the decisions we made on the survey. So you're underplaying your hand a little bit on how good you are at interviewing.
well,
But
I
humility is a
appreciate
virtue too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
humility. Yeah, you're showing way too much humility.
Well, there's humility and there's sandbagging, and I'm not sandbagging. But well, anyway, what an amazing episode. It was so interesting to get y'all's thoughts about what you're doing and the process by which I got to where you are today. And I hope we get a chance to talk about this again soon. So
Yeah, me
with
too.
that, and we shall say, first of all, thank everyone for listening and then checking out the podcast. Please share it with everyone that you know and love. They will be impressed by the type of material you're taking in on a regular basis. But with that, Matt, Steve, I shall say adieu.
Yeah, thanks again so much, Ross. Steve said amazing questions, and I'm going to be thinking about them for a long time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Adieu. Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Miller.